My husband's hospital bills took everything. I became a gardener to survive. The butler warned, "Ignore the girl in the window. She hasn't spoken since her mom abandoned her." I saw the sadness in her eyes and placed my prize flower on the windowsill. 3 weeks later, the billionaire froze in the garden. The mute girl was sitting in the dirt with me, having fun. What he did after that made me cry. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Pauline Matthews, and at 68 years old, I never imagined I would be kneeling in someone else's garden dirt under my fingernails working for $2,500 a month just to have a roof over my head. But that's what happens when the love of your life fights cancer for 3 years and loses. That's what happens when the medical bills pile up to $350,000 and the insurance companies find every loophole to deny coverage. Conrad had been gone for 8 months when I finally accepted that our little house on Maple Street wasn't ours anymore. The bank had been patient. I'll give them that. They'd even seemed genuinely sorry when they handed me the foreclosure papers. But sorry doesn't pay mortgages, and my teacher's pension of $1,200 a month barely covered groceries, let alone the crushing debt that followed my husband's death like a shadow. The employment agency lady, a kind woman named Mrs. Henderson, had looked at me with those pitying eyes I'd grown to despise. At your age, dear with your circumstances, domestic positions are really your best option. Live-in positions provide housing which eliminates your biggest expense. She'd said it gently, but the message was clear. At 68, recently widowed and financially ruined, I wasn't exactly a hot commodity in the job market. That's how I found myself driving my aging Honda Civic up the winding driveway of the Blackwood estate on a gray October morning. The mansion loomed ahead of me, all white columns and manicured perfection, making me feel smaller with each yard I traveled. I'd spent 40 years teaching elementary school, had owned my own home, had been respected in my community. Now I was about to become the help. The head groundskeeper, a weathered man named Thomas, met me at the service entrance. He looked me up and down with the expression of someone who'd seen too many desperate people come and go. "You're the new gardener," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mrs. Henderson said you have experience." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Experience was putting it kindly. I'd had a backyard garden that Conrad and I had tended together for 37 years. We'd grown tomatoes, and roses had even won a few ribbons at the county fair. But this was different. This was survival. "Follow me," Thomas said, leading me along a stone path that probably cost more than my annual salary. The Blackwoods are particular about their privacy. The main family lives in the house, of course. Mr. Richard Blackwood owns several technology companies, very successful. His wife Victoria is, well, she's particular about things being done right. And there's the little girl Sophie. She's 7. He paused at a fork in the path, and I noticed his expression soften slightly. The butler, Mr. Carlilele, he'll give you the full briefing, but I'll tell you this now, because it's important. You see that window up there, 2nd floor? The bay window, with the blue cushions. I followed his gaze to a large window where I could just make out a small figure sitting motionless, staring down at the gardens. That's Sophie's room. She sits there most days, just watching. Been like that for 3 years now, ever since her mother left. Hasn't spoken a word since. Not one word. The doctors call it selective mutism. Trauma-related. Mrs. Blackwood has tried everything. Therapists, specialists even considered sending her to a residential facility. My heart clenched. I'd taught enough children to recognize the signs of deep hurt, the kind that burrows so deep it changes the very foundation of who you are. The thing is, Thomas continued, lowering his voice, Mr. Carroll and I, we have an understanding with the family. We don't engage with Sophie. Mrs. Blackwood feels it's better that way. Less confusion for the child, she says. So you'll see her sometimes, but you're to keep your distance. Understood? I wanted to argue. Wanted to say that isolation never healed a child's wounded heart. But I needed this job. I needed the small room in the servants' quarters, the steady meals, the chance to start over. So I nodded. Mister. Carlile the butler was exactly what you'd expect from a house like this. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of formal bearing that came from years of serving wealthy families. He led me through a maze of service corridors to my room. A small but clean space under the eaves, with a window overlooking the back gardens. Your duties will include maintenance of the formal gardens, the rose beds, and the greenhouse, he explained in crisp, professional tones. Mrs. Blackwood is hosting a garden party in 6 weeks for her charity foundation, so everything must be perfect. The family keeps early hours. Breakfast at 7, lunch at 1 o'clock, dinner at 7 o'clock. You'll take your meals in the kitchen with the other staff. Sundays are your half days, though you're expected to remain on the property. As he turned to leave, he paused. And Pauline, may I call you Pauline about the little girl? It's truly better for everyone if you maintain appropriate boundaries. The child has been through enough disruption. After he left, I sat on the narrow bed and looked around my new home. 4 walls, a small dresser, a window with a view. It wasn't much, but it was mine for as long as I could keep this job. I unpacked my few belongings, mostly practical clothes, my gardening tools, and a small wooden box that contained my most precious possessions. My wedding ring, which I still wore a photo of Conrad and me on our honeymoon, and the small notebook where I'd kept track of our garden over the years, noting what thrived and what failed, what brought joy and what brought disappointment. At the bottom of the box, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was my pride and joy seeds from the rows I'd developed in our backyard. Conrad and I had spent 5 years cross-pollinating and selecting until we'd created something unique, a deep red bloom with the hardiness to survive harsh winters and the fragrance to fill an entire yard. I'd planned to name it Conrad's Memory and enter it in competitions. Now it felt like all I had left of our life together. The next morning I began my work in earnest. The Blackwood gardens were magnificent, I had to admit. Acres of formal hedges, flower beds that looked like they belonged in magazines, and a greenhouse that was better equipped than most nurseries. But there was something cold about it all. Something too perfect, too controlled, like a museum exhibit rather than a living space. I was pruning the rose beds near the house when I felt eyes on me. I looked up to see Sophie at her window, her small face pale against the glass. She couldn't have weighed more than 50 pounds, all sharp angles and huge dark eyes. Her hair was dark like her father's, but her expression. There was an old sadness there that no 7-year-old should carry. Our eyes met for just a moment before she pulled back from the window, disappearing into the shadows of her room. But something in that brief connection stirred something in me I thought I'd lost. The teacher in me. Maybe the part that had always been drawn to the quiet ones, the children who carried their pain like a secret. That evening, after finishing my rounds in the greenhouse, I made a decision that would change everything. I took one of the Conrad's memory seeds from my wooden box and planted it in a small pot using soil I'd specially prepared with compost and nutrients. It was risky. The seed was precious, irreplaceable, but something told me it was important. For 2 weeks, I tended that small pot in secret, keeping it in a corner of the greenhouse where the family rarely ventured. I watched for the first green shoots, the way Conrad and I used to do together, holding our breath and hoping. And when the tiny plant finally pushed through the soil, I felt a spark of something I'd almost forgotten. Hope. The plant grew quickly, stronger than I'd expected in this environment. Within a month, it had developed into a small but sturdy bush, and by early November, it produced its first bloom. The flower was perfect. Deep red petals with just a hint of pink at the edges. A fragrance that was both sweet and complex. Conrad would have been proud. That's when I made the decision that would set everything in motion. On a crisp November morning, when the household was busy with Mrs. Blackwood's charity breakfast downstairs, I took my precious rose, the first and only bloom of Conrad's memory, and placed it carefully on Sophie's windowsill. I didn't leave a note, didn't try to get her attention. I simply set it there in a small glass vase I'd found in the greenhouse and walked away. But as I rounded the corner of the house, I couldn't resist looking back. Sophie was there at the window, her small hands pressed against the glass, staring down at the rose with an expression I couldn't quite read. For just a moment, our eyes met again, and this time she didn't pull away. 3 weeks later, on a morning when the first snow was beginning to dust the perfectly manicured gardens, I was working near the back of the property when I heard something that made my heart stop. A small voice barely above a whisper coming from somewhere behind me. "Play with me." I turned slowly, and there she was, Sophie, standing at the edge of the formal garden in her small coat and boots, holding my rose in her hands like it was made of spun glass. She was looking directly at me, and though her voice was soft, her words were unmistakable. "Play with me," she said again, and this time there was something almost desperate in her tone. I stood frozen in the November morning light, my pruning shears forgotten in my hands, staring at this small girl who had just spoken her first words in 3 years. Sophie clutched my rose against her chest like a lifeline, her dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that took my breath away. "Play with me," she said again. And I realized she was trembling not from cold, but from the enormous effort it had taken to break her silence. Everything in me wanted to rush to her, to gather her up and promise her that yes, of course I would play with her. But Thomas's warnings echoed in my mind. Mr. Carroll's stern instructions about maintaining boundaries. I glanced toward the house, half expecting to see Mrs. Blackwood materializing in one of the windows, ready to dismiss me on the spot. "Sophie," I said softly, crouching down to her level. "That's a very special flower you're holding. Do you like it?" She nodded solemnly, her grip on the vase never loosening. Up close, I could see how thin she was, how her coat hung loose on her small frame. There were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights, and her hair needed a proper brushing. "My grandmother had roses," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse before she went away. "Grandmother." My heart clenched. Of course, to a child of 7, a mother might seem ancient, might be remembered as a grandmother figure, especially if she'd been the primary caretaker. I wondered what story Sophie had been told about why her mother went away. "Would you like to help me plant some more roses?" I asked, making a decision that I knew could cost me my job. "I have a special place where they would grow very well." Her face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. She nodded eagerly, and I found myself leading her toward the back corner of the property where a small walled garden sat mostly forgotten. It had probably been a kitchen garden once, but now it was overgrown with weeds and brambles. "This will be our secret garden," I told her, pushing open the rusty gate. "Just yours and mine. Would you like that?" "Yes," she breathed, and the word carried all the longing of a child who had been holding her voice prisoner for far too long. We spent the next hour clearing a small patch of earth, Sophie, working beside me with surprising determination. She was stronger than she looked, and clearly hungry for purpose, for connection. As we worked, she began to talk in halting whispers about the roses she remembered, about a fountain that used to work, about hiding places where she and her grandmother used to play. "She had dark hair like yours," Sophie said suddenly, looking up at me with those penetrating eyes. "And she smelled like flowers, not like perfume. Mrs. Victoria always smells like perfume. Mrs. Victoria, not Mommy or even Victoria, but the formal address of someone who felt like a stranger in her own home. "Tell me about your grandmother," I said gently, continuing to weed the soil. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her small hands working methodically to remove rocks from the dirt. "She used to read to me," she finally said. "Real books, not the ones Mrs. Victoria picks. And she would sing when she thought no one was listening. She had a music box with a dancing lady inside, a memory not of a grandmother, but of her mother. I was certain now. The question was, What had really happened to her? And why was Sophie calling her grandmother? "Do you miss her?" I asked. The little girl's hand stilled, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She promised she'd come back," she whispered. "She said she would never really leave me. But Mrs. Victoria says she was lying, that she got tired of taking care of me and wanted to go have adventures instead." My hands clenched involuntarily around the weeds I was pulling. What kind of person tells a child that her mother abandoned her because she was a burden? I forced my voice to remain steady. Sometimes grown-ups have to go away even when they don't want to. It doesn't mean they stopped loving us. Sophie nodded seriously, as if this was a concept she'd been wrestling with for years. "That's what I think too. Mrs. Victoria gets angry when I say that, though. She says I'm being silly and that I need to accept reality." We worked in comfortable silence after that, and I found myself studying this remarkable child who had been carrying such a heavy emotional burden alone. There was an intelligence in her eyes that reminded me of my brightest students, the ones who saw more than adults realized, who understood the world in ways that both impressed and worried me. When we finished preparing the small plot, I had Sophie help me plant 3 more seeds for my precious collection. As we worked, I taught her about soil preparation, about giving plants space to grow, about the patience required for gardening. "When will they bloom?" she asked carefully, covering the last seed with soil. "If we take good care of them, by next summer, we should see flowers," I told her. "But gardens teach us patience. Good things take time." She nodded solemnly, then looked up at me with an expression far too mature for her 7 years. "Mrs. Pauline, will you still be here next summer?" The question hit me like a physical blow. In her short life, this child had already learned that people disappear, that promises are broken, that even mothers can vanish without explanation. How could I promise her anything when I was just the hired help, disposable and replaceable? "I'll do everything I can to stay," I said finally. "But Sophie, even if something happens and I have to go away, it won't be because I don't care about you. Sometimes grown-ups don't get to choose where they live or work." She studied my face intently, then nodded. "Like my grandmother." "Yes," I said softly. "Like your grandmother." We met like this several more times over the following weeks. Always in our secret garden. Always when the family was occupied elsewhere. Sophie would appear like a little ghost, usually carrying the vase with my rose, which she'd somehow managed to keep alive in her room. We would work together, planting and tending, and slowly she began to open up more. She told me about the tutor Mrs. Victoria had hired a stern woman who believed children should be seen and not heard. She told me about the therapists who asked her endless questions about why she wouldn't talk, never seeming to understand that she had nothing to say to them. She told me about lying awake at night, listening to arguments between her father and Mrs. Victoria. Words she didn't understand, but tones she recognized all too well. "Daddy works a lot," she said one afternoon as we watered our small seedlings. "He's always in his office or traveling. Mrs. Victoria says he's very important and has important things to do. What about you?" I asked. "Are you important too?" She looked at me with surprise, as if this was a question that had never occurred to her. "I don't know," she said quietly. "Mrs. Victoria says I'm difficult. She says if I would just try harder, to be normal, everyone would be happier." Normal, as if there was something wrong with a 7-year-old who had lost her mother and responded by retreating into silence. As if trauma was a choice, a failing of character, rather than a natural response to overwhelming loss. "Sophie," I said carefully, "you're not difficult. You're a little girl who has been through something very sad, and you're doing the best you can. That's all any of us can do." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mrs. Victoria wants to send me away to a special school. I heard her talking to Daddy about it. She says I need professional help and that it's not fair to expect her to deal with a child who won't respond to normal parenting." My blood ran cold, a special school and institution. I'd seen too many children over the years who had been sent away when they became inconvenient, labeled as problems, rather than treated as human beings who needed extra care and patience. "When did you hear this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Last week." They were in Daddy's office after dinner. "Mrs. Victoria was crying and saying she's tried everything, but I make her nervous and she can't bond with me the way she should. She said, maybe if I was somewhere with people who specialize in troubled children, I might finally start talking to the right people." Troubled children. As if seeking connection with a kind gardener instead of a cold stepmother was evidence of mental illness. "And what did your daddy say?" Sophie's expression grew even sadder. "He said he'd think about it. He always says he'll think about it when Mrs. Victoria wants something, but he usually does what she wants in the end." That night, I lay awake in my small room staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what to do with the information Sophie had shared. She was clearly not getting the emotional support she needed at home, and now there was talk of sending her away. Everything in my teacher's heart rebelled against the idea of this sensitive child being shipped off to an institution simply because she was inconvenient. But what could I do? I was just the gardener, a woman who cleaned up other people's messes for $2,500 a month and a roof over her head. I had no legal standing, no authority, no resources. The next morning, as I was tending the greenhouse, I heard voices from the main house that made me stop and listen. Mrs. Victoria was speaking in sharp, urgent tones to someone on the phone. No Dr. Martinez. "I don't think outpatient therapy is working. She's been seeing specialists for 3 years with no real progress, and now she started exhibiting new concerning behaviors. I caught her outside yesterday talking to herself in some kind of make-believe scenario. It's becoming worse, not better." My hands went still on the watering can, talking to herself. Mrs. Victoria had seen Sophie in our garden, had seen her talking to me, but had interpreted it as further evidence of mental illness rather than the breakthrough it actually was. "A residential program would give her the intensive support she clearly needs," Mrs. Victoria continued, "and frankly, it would give our family a chance to heal as well. This situation is putting tremendous strain on my marriage." Strain on her marriage. Not concern for Sophie's well-being, but worry about her own comfort and convenience. Yes, I understand it's expensive, but money isn't the issue. Her father can certainly afford it. And honestly, at this point, I think it's our only option. She's becoming more withdrawn and strange every day. I set down the watering can and walked quickly back toward the house, my mind racing. Sophie was in danger of being sent away labeled as mentally ill simply because she'd found comfort in our friendship rather than accepting Mrs. Victoria's version of maternal care. As I rounded the corner near the rose beds, I saw movement at Sophie's window. She was there as always, but today she was pressing a piece of paper against the glass. Even from a distance, I could see it was a drawing. Stick figures in a garden. One tall figure and one small one surrounded by flowers. She had drawn us our secret times together. And if Mrs. Victoria found that drawing, if she understood what it meant, Sophie would be taken away faster than either of us could imagine. I had to find a way to protect this child, even if it meant risking everything I'd built here. The opportunity to uncover the truth came 3 days later when Mrs. Victoria left for a weekend spa retreat in the mountains. She'd been particularly agitated all week, making phone calls to various doctors and educational consultants. Her voice carrying that sharp edge it got when she was orchestrating something she knew others wouldn't approve of. "I need this time to recharge," she announced at breakfast, though her words were directed more at Mr. Carryle than at her husband or stepdaughter. "The stress of Sophie's condition has been overwhelming. Dr. Martinez thinks some distance will help me gain perspective on our next steps." Richard barely looked up from his newspaper. "Of course, darling. Take all the time you need." Sophie, picking at her scrambled eggs, said nothing. but I noticed how her shoulders relaxed just slightly when the front door closed behind Victoria's departing figure. With Victoria gone, the house felt different. Less watched, less tense. Richard disappeared into his office as usual, immersed in conference calls and business reports, leaving Sophie to wander the halls like a small ghost. I was trimming the hedge near the morning room when I saw her slip out the back door, making her way toward our secret garden. I waited a few minutes, then followed. I found her sitting cross-legged on the ground where we'd planted our roses, talking softly to the small green shoots that were just beginning to emerge. "They're growing," she said when she saw me, her voice filled with wonder. "Look, Mrs. Pauline, they're really growing." I knelt beside her, examining the tender new growth. "They're strong, just like you," I said. "Sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the darkest places." Sophie was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mrs. Victoria left because of me, didn't she? Because I'm too much trouble." My heart ached for this child who had somehow learned to blame herself for every adult's departure from her life. "No, sweetheart. Mrs. Victoria left because she needed some time away. That's about her, not about you." "But she wants to send me away too," Sophie said, matter-of-factly. "I heard her talking to Daddy again last night. She found a school in Switzerland that specializes in children like me." Switzerland. My blood chilled. Not just an institution, but 1,000 of miles away from everything Sophie knew. Children like you. Troubled children who don't respond to normal family life. Sophie recited, clearly repeating words she'd overheard. She says, "Maybe if I'm around other broken children, I'll learn how to be normal." Broken children. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. This was a 7-year-old girl who had lost her mother and retreated into protective silence, not a defective object that needed to be sent away for repair. "Sophie," I said carefully, "what do you remember about before Mrs. Victoria came to live here, about your life with your grandmother?" Sophie's face lit up with the first genuine joy I'd seen from her. "Everything was different then. The house was full of music and laughter. We would bake cookies in the kitchen and she would let me lick the spoon. She would read to me every night. And on Sundays, we would have picnics right here in this garden. This garden was different then." "Oh yes," Sophie said, gesturing around us. "There were flowers everywhere, and vegetables, and a little pond with fish. Grandmother said it was our special place where we could be ourselves without worrying about being perfect." The picture she painted was so different from the sterile, controlled environment I'd come to know. A home where a child was allowed to be a child, where joy and spontaneity were welcomed rather than suppressed. "What happened to change everything?" I asked gently. Sophie's expression grew somber. "Grandmother got sick, very sick. She would cry sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking, and she got thinner and thinner. The doctors came to the house a lot, and there were always hushed conversations in the hallway, sick, not abandoned, not tired of being a mother, sick. And then Mrs. Victoria came. At first, she was just Daddy's friend. She would visit sometimes, and she was very nice to me when Grandmother was having her bad days. She would bring me presents and tell me stories about all the places she'd traveled. But after Sophie's voice trailed off and I saw tears forming in her eyes. "After what, sweetheart?" "After the funeral," she whispered, "after Grandmother went to heaven. Mrs. Victoria moved in to take care of us. But she said I was too old to need the kind of babying that Grandmother had given me. She said I needed to learn to be more independent, more mature." Funeral. So Sophie's mother had died, and Victoria had swooped in during their grief to position herself as the solution to Richard's single parenthood. But why was Sophie calling her mother Grandmother? "Sophie," I said carefully. "When you say grandmother, you mean your daddy's mother, right? Your father's mother, who lived here with you." Sophie looked at me with confusion. "No, silly, I mean my grandmother Sarah. She was my mama's mama, but she took care of me when mama couldn't anymore." My world tilted. Sophie's mother had been unable to care for her, so her maternal grandmother had stepped in. That grandmother had died, and Victoria had married Richard, becoming Sophie's stepmother. But what had happened to Sophie's actual mother? "Where is your mama now, Sophie?" The little girl's face crumpled. "Mrs. Victoria says she went away because she got tired of being responsible. She says Mama was too young when she had me, and that when grandmother got sick, she saw a chance to escape and took it. She says some people aren't meant to be parents." But something in Sophie's tone told me she didn't fully believe this story any more than I did. "What do you think happened to your mama?" Sophie looked around carefully, as if checking to make sure we were truly alone, then leaned closer to me. "I think Mrs. Victoria is lying," she whispered. "I found something in the attic that I'm not supposed to have." That evening, after dinner service was finished and the house had settled into its quiet routine, Sophie appeared at my door. It was highly irregular. Staff and family were supposed to maintain clear boundaries about living spaces, but something in her expression told me this was important. "Mrs. Pauline," she whispered, "can you come with me? I want to show you something, but I'm scared to go alone." I glanced down the hallway. Richard was in his office with the door closed, probably working late as usual. The other staff had retired to their quarters. It felt safe enough. Sophie led me up the main staircase past the family bedrooms to a narrow door I'd never noticed before. She produced a small key from her pocket. "Grandmother gave me this before she got too sick," she explained. She said it opened the door to our memories, and that someday, when I was ready, I should look at what was inside. The attic was dusty and dim, filled with the kinds of things wealthy families accumulate over generations. Furniture covered in white sheets, boxes of books, old paintings. But Sophie led me directly to a specific corner where a trunk sat beneath a small window. "It's all here," she said, lifting the lid. "Everything about my real mama." Inside was a treasure trove of memories. Photo albums filled with pictures of a young woman who looked exactly like an adult version of Sophie. The same dark hair, the same intelligent eyes, the same delicate features. Pictures of her graduation from college, her wedding to Richard, her pregnancy, her obvious joy holding baby Sophie. "This is your mama," I said softly, and Sophie nodded. Her name was Elena. Grandmother told me she was the most beautiful person inside and out, and that she loved me more than anything in the whole world. I flipped through the album, seeing the progression of Elena's life. There were pictures of her and Richard looking deeply in love. Pictures of her painting in a sunlit studio. Pictures of her teaching Sophie to walk, to read, to garden. And then gradually the pictures became fewer and farther between. What happened to her, Sophie? What really happened? Sophie pulled out a manila folder from the bottom of the trunk. Inside were medical records, legal documents, and newspaper clippings. My heart stopped as I read the headlines. Local artist dies in car accident. Young mother killed in highway collision. Elena Blackwood, 26, died instantly when her vehicle collided with a drunk driver on Highway 91. She is survived by her husband, Richard, and daughter, Sophie, age 4. Sophie hadn't been abandoned. Her mother had been killed when she was only 4 years old. But why didn't she remember this? Why did she think her grandmother had been her primary caretaker? I found the answer in the medical records tucked beneath the newspaper clippings. After Elena's death, Sophie had been hospitalized for severe trauma and depression. She'd stopped speaking, stopped eating, had what the doctors called a complete psychological breakdown. Richard, devastated by his own grief, had been unable to cope with his daughter's condition. That's when Elena's mother, Sarah, had stepped in. She'd moved into the Blackwood house to care for Sophie. Had spent 2 years patiently helping her granddaughter heal from the trauma of losing her mother. In Sophie's mind, those became her happiest memories, the time when grandmother Sarah made her feel safe and loved again. But then Sarah had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, According to the medical records, she'd fought it for 8 months before dying when Sophie was 6. Sophie had lost her mother and then her grandmother within 2 years. No wonder she'd retreated into silence again. "Sophie," I said gently, "do you remember your mama at all? Your real mama, Elena?" Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her small fingers tracing one of the photographs. "Sometimes I dream about her," she said finally. "In the dreams she's singing to me and braiding my hair, but Mrs. Victoria says those are just fantasies, that I'm remembering movies or stories grandmother told me." Victoria had been systematically erasing Elena's memory, convincing Sophie that her own recollections of her mother were false. She'd rewritten history to make Elena the villain, the abandoning mother, instead of the loving parent who had been tragically killed. Why would Mrs. Victoria tell you your mama abandoned you when she actually died? Sophie looked up at me with those two wise eyes, because Mrs. Victoria wants to be my only mama. Grandmother Sarah told me that before she died. She said some people can't stand sharing love, that they want to be the only important person in your life. At the bottom of the trunk, I found one more item that made everything click into place. A sealed envelope labeled for Sophie's 18th birthday. Inside was a letter in Sarah's handwriting. "My dearest Sophie," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone. And you are finally old enough to understand the truth about your family. Your mother Elena was the most loving person I ever knew, and she died protecting that love. She was driving home from buying you a birthday present when the accident happened. She had planned a surprise party for your 5th birthday, complete with a princess cake and a pony ride in the back garden." I stopped reading aloud as Sophie began to cry softly. "I know that by now someone has probably told you that Elena left you, that she chose her own happiness over yours. This is a lie designed to make you grateful for whatever substitute love you've been offered. Your mother died loving you with every fiber of her being, and her last words were your name." The letter went on to detail Elena's hopes and dreams for Sophie, her wishes for her daughter's education and future, and her hopes that Sophie would remember her with joy rather than sadness. Most importantly, the letter concluded, "Never let anyone convince you that you are difficult, broken, or unworthy of love. Your mother fought for you every day of her life, and I fought for you every day of mine. Now you must fight for yourself." Sophie looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "So my mama didn't leave me?" "No, sweetheart," I said, pulling her close. "Your mama loved you so much, she died trying to get home to you. And your grandmother, Sarah, loved you enough to spend her last years making sure you knew how precious you are. Then why does Mrs. Victoria want to send me away?" I held her tighter, feeling a protective rage building in my chest. "Because some people can't stand competition for love, even from a little girl who deserves to be cherished." As we sat there in the dusty attic surrounded by the evidence of Sophie's true family history, I made a decision that would change both our lives. Victoria might have the legal right to make decisions about Sophie's future, but she didn't have the moral right to erase this child's identity and ship her off to an institution. Sophie deserved to know who she really was, where she came from, and how deeply she had been loved. And I was going to make sure she got the chance to fight for herself, just as her mother and grandmother had fought for her. The only question was how to do it without losing the position that allowed me to protect her in the first place. Victoria returned from her spa weekend like a storm front moving in, all sharp energy and barely contained fury. I could feel the change in the house's atmosphere the moment her car pulled into the circular driveway on Monday morning. Even the other staff members seemed to sense it moving more quietly, keeping their heads down as they went about their duties. I was in the greenhouse tending to the seedlings I'd started for the spring garden when Mr. Carryle appeared in the doorway. His usually composed expression carried a hint of worry that made my stomach clench. "Mrs. Blackwood would like to see you in the morning room," he said formally. Immediately, the morning room was Victoria's domain. all pale yellow silk and delicate antiques. The kind of space that made you afraid to breathe too heavily lest you disturb something worth more than my annual salary. Victoria stood with her back to me, looking out the tall windows toward the gardens, her posture rigid with barely controlled anger. "Close the door, Pauline," she said without turning around. I did as instructed, my heart beginning to race. Something in her tone told me this conversation had been building since the moment she left for her retreat. "How long have you been talking to Sophie?" The question was direct, delivered with surgical precision. No preamble, no polite small talk. Victoria had done her homework while she was away, had probably spent hours planning exactly how to handle this situation. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Blackwood," I said carefully. She turned then, and I saw something in her eyes that chilled me to the bone. Not anger exactly, but something colder, more calculating. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "I've been watching. I've been paying attention, and I've been asking questions." She moved to the small writing desk in the corner and picked up a manila folder. "Mrs. Henderson at the employment agency was very helpful. She told me all about your circumstances, the dead husband, the medical debts, the foreclosure. Quite tragic, really. A woman your age reduced to manual labor just to keep a roof over her head." My throat went dry. She'd been investigating me building a profile of my vulnerabilities. She also mentioned how grateful you were for this position, how you promised you'd do anything to keep it. I found that particularly interesting, given your recent boundary issues. Victoria opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs. My blood turned to ice as I recognized them. Pictures of me and Sophie in our secret garden, working side by side, talking, laughing. Someone had been watching us, documenting our interactions. "Thomas has been very observant," Victoria said, noting my expression. "I asked him to keep an eye on the family's welfare while I was away." Imagine my surprise when he reported that the new gardener had been conducting unauthorized interactions with my stepdaughter Thomas, the man who had warned me to stay away from Sophie, who had seemed genuinely concerned about maintaining proper boundaries. He'd been reporting to Victoria all along. "Mrs. Blackwood," I began, but she cut me off with a sharp gesture. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "Sophie has been making progress with her therapist, finally starting to accept her new family structure. And then you come along with your flowers and your grandmother act, and suddenly she's talking again, but only to you. Do you understand how that undermines everything we've been working toward progress? As if convincing a grieving child that her mother had abandoned her was therapeutic progress." "I never meant to interfere with Sophie's treatment," I said carefully. "I was just trying to be kind to a child who seemed lonely." Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Kind, how noble. But kindness from the wrong person can be incredibly destructive, Pauline. Sophie doesn't need a surrogate grandmother figure encouraging her fantasies and delusions. She needs to learn to bond with her actual family. Fantasies and delusions, like remembering her mother with love, instead of accepting Victoria's version of abandonment." "Sophie is a remarkable child," I said, finding my voice. "She's intelligent and sensitive and capable of so much more than what Victoria's eyes flashed, than what I'm giving her. Let me tell you something about Sophie, Pauline. She's been traumatized, yes, but she's also learned to use that trauma to manipulate adults into giving her excessive attention and special treatment. What you see as sensitivity, I see as manipulation. What you see as a need for nurturing, I see as resistance to growing up and accepting reality. The casual cruelty of her assessment took my breath away. This was how she saw a 7-year-old child who had lost everyone she'd ever loved as a manipulator, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cherished. She's been through tremendous loss, I said, unable to keep the emotion out of my voice. She needs patience and understanding. Not discipline, not boundaries, not expectations that she behave like a normal child instead of a perpetual victim." Victoria stepped closer. her voice dropping to an ominous whisper. "Let me be very clear, Pauline. I've spent the last 3 years trying to give Sophie a stable, structured environment where she can heal and thrive. I will not let a desperate old woman with boundary issues undermine that work." Desperate old woman. The words hit like physical blows, all the more painful because there was truth in them. I was desperate. Desperate to keep this job, desperate for purpose, desperate for connection after losing everything that had mattered to me. Now Victoria continued, returning to her position by the window. "Here's what's going to happen. You will cease all contact with Sophie immediately. No more secret garden visits. No more flowers on windowsills. No more encouraging her inappropriate attachment to you. You will return to focusing exclusively on your gardening duties. And if I don't, I asked though, I already knew the answer." Victoria smiled. "And it was like watching a snake prepare to strike. Then you'll find yourself without employment, without references, and without any hope of finding similar work at your age. I have connections throughout this industry. Pauline, one phone call from me, and you'll be unhireable anywhere that matters." The threat was clear and credible. In this small, interconnected world of wealthy families and domestic staff, Victoria's word would carry significant weight. She could destroy my chances of finding work anywhere similar families might hire. But more than that, she continued, "I think you should understand exactly what Sophie's future holds, with or without your interference. Dr. Martinez has recommended an excellent residential facility in Switzerland, a place that specializes in helping traumatized children like Sophie develop proper emotional regulation and social skills." My heart stopped. "You're still planning to send her away? I'm planning to get her the help she clearly needs," Victoria said smoothly. "Help that she can't receive in an environment where well-meaning but unqualified people encourage her to retreat into fantasy rather than engage with reality." "She's not retreating into fantasy," I protested. "She's a little girl who's found someone who listens to her, who treats her with respect, who feeds her delusions about her past and enables her refusal to bond with her actual family." Victoria interrupted. "Do you know what Sophie told Dr. Martinez last week? She said she'd found a new grandmother who understood her better than anyone in her real family. She said this new grandmother made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt since the old grandmother died." The way Victoria said old grandmother made it clear she was talking about Sarah Elelina's mother. She was using Sophie's attachment to me as evidence of mental instability rather than recognizing it as a sign of healing. "Dr. Martinez was quite concerned," Victoria continued. "He said it indicated that Sophie is still unable to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate relationships, that she's seeking parental figures outside her family unit, rather than learning to accept the love and guidance available within it. Maybe she seeks connection outside her family because she doesn't feel truly accepted within it." I said, my anger finally overcoming my caution. Victoria's expression went deadly cold. "Excuse me." I knew I was crossing a line that could cost me everything, but I couldn't stop myself. This woman was planning to send Sophie away based on twisted interpretations of normal childhood behavior, and I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. "Sophie is a bright, loving child who has endured tremendous loss," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "She doesn't need to be shipped off to an institution. She needs to be in a home where she feels valued and understood." "And you think you understand her better than her own family?" Victoria's voice was dangerously quiet. "I think I understand what it feels like to lose everything you love and have to start over," I said. "I think I understand what it means to be dismissed as inconvenient by people who should care about your well-being." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Victoria stared at me for a long moment, and I could practically see her recalculating, deciding how to handle this unexpected defiance from someone who was supposed to be grateful and compliant. "You know what I think, Pauline?" she said finally. "I think you're projecting your own issues onto Sophie." I think you see a motherless child and imagine you can fill that role, can find purpose and meaning in playing savior to someone else's family. But Sophie doesn't need saving. She needs professional help and a stable family environment. She moved to the door, then turned back to face me. You have 24 hours to decide whether you want to keep this job or continue interfering with Sophie's treatment. If I see you speaking to her, if I catch you encouraging her fantasies about the past, if you give her so much as a flower, I will have you removed from this property immediately. And Sophie, I asked, what happens to her? Victoria's smile was triumphant. Sophie will be enrolled at the Meadowbrook Institute in Switzerland within the month. It's a lovely place, very structured, very therapeutic. She'll learn to interact appropriately with authority figures and to form healthy attachments with qualified professionals rather than random staff members. She paused in the doorway. Oh, and Pauline, in case you're thinking of discussing any of this with Richard, I should mention that he's already signed the preliminary enrollment papers. He agrees that Sophie needs more intensive help than we can provide at home, especially given her recent regression into inappropriate behaviors. Richard had already agreed. Sophie's fate was sealed, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Nothing except risk everything I had left in a battle I couldn't possibly win. After Victoria left, I sat alone in the morning room, my hands shaking as the full weight of her threat settled over me. In 24 hours, I would have to choose between my own survival and Sophie's well-being. I could keep my job, my security, my small safe place in the world by abandoning a 7-year-old child who trusted me. Or I could fight for her and lose everything. My position, my home, my hope of ever finding similar work again. But as I sat there, I remembered Sophie's face when she'd shown me the photographs of her mother, the wonder in her voice when she talked about Elena's love for her. I remembered her small hands carefully tending our rose seedlings, her whispered confessions about lying awake, listening to arguments about her future, and I realized that some things were worth losing everything for. The question was whether I had the courage to risk it all for a child who wasn't even mine. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my small bed under the eaves, staring at the ceiling, and wrestling with a decision that would determine not just my future, but Sophie's as well. Outside my window, storm clouds gathered, matching the turmoil in my heart. By morning, I had made my choice. I found Sophie in her usual place at the bay window, still in her nightgown, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens. She looked smaller than ever, more fragile, as if she sensed that something fundamental was about to change in her already unstable world. I tapped lightly on her bedroom door, knowing I was violating every boundary Victoria had set, risking everything I'd worked to build here. Sophie turned, and when she saw me, her face lit up with a smile that broke my heart. "Mrs. Pauline?" she whispered, glancing nervously toward the hallway. "Mrs. Victoria said, I'm not supposed to talk to you anymore." "I know, sweetheart," I said softly, stepping into her room and closing the door behind me. "That's why I need to talk to you now, before things change." Sophie's expression grew worried. "Are you leaving?" The simple question hit me like a physical blow. In her short life, everyone she'd ever loved had left. First her mother through death, then her grandmother. The same way, and now potentially me, through Victoria's menations. How could I explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes fighting for someone means risking your ability to stay with them? "Sophie," I said, kneeling down so we were at eye level, "I need you to understand something very important. No matter what happens, no matter what anyone tells you, you are not broken. You are not difficult. You are not a problem that needs to be fixed." Her eyes filled with tears. "But Mrs. Victoria says..." "Mrs. Victoria is wrong," I said firmly. "She's telling you things that aren't true because it makes her feel better about the choices she's making. But you need to know who you really are." I pulled from my apron pocket the small photo I'd taken from the attic. one of Elena holding baby Sophie, both of them radiating joy and love. This is your mama, Sophie. Your real mama, Elena. She didn't leave you because she stopped loving you. She died in a car accident when you were 4 years old, and her last words were your name. Sophie took the photograph with trembling hands, studying Elena's face with desperate intensity. I remember her, she whispered. I remember her singing to me. Those aren't fantasies or dreams, I told her. Those are real memories of a mother who loved you with everything she had. And your grandmother, Sarah, loved you too. She fought for you until the very end. Then why does Mrs. Victoria want to send me away? I took a deep breath, knowing I was about to say words that could never be taken back because some people can't stand sharing love, because she wants to be the only important person in your daddy's life, and you remind him every day that he had a different life before her. A life where Elena was the center of his world. Sophie studied the photograph for a long moment, then looked up at me with those wise dark eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. What's going to happen to me before I could answer? The bedroom door burst open. Victoria stood there in her silk robe, her face twisted with fury that she didn't even try to hide. What the hell do you think you're doing? She hissed, stepping into the room like a predator, cornering its prey. Sophie immediately shrank back against her window seat, clutching the photograph to her chest. I stood slowly, placing myself between Victoria and the little girl. I'm telling Sophie the truth about her family, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Victoria's eyes went to the photograph in Sophie's hands, and something dangerous flashed across her face. Give me that, she demanded, extending her hand towards Sophie. That belongs in the attic with the rest of the past. No, Sophie said, and though her voice was small, there was steel in it. It's my mama. Your mama abandoned you. Victoria snapped, her composure finally cracking completely. She was a selfish girl who got pregnant too young and regretted it every day until she found an excuse to run away. That's not true, Sophie whispered. But Victoria wasn't finished. She left you crying in your crib while she went out to parties. She complained constantly about how having a baby had ruined her life. She was planning to leave your father and take half his money when that accident happened. An accident that was probably her own fault because she was always driving recklessly when she was upset. Each lie was delivered with vicious precision designed to destroy whatever healing Sophie had found in learning the truth about Elena. I watched the little girl's face crumple as Victoria's poison words hit their target. Stop it, I said, my voice sharp with anger. She's just a child. She's a disturbed child who needs to learn to live in reality instead of fairy tales, Victoria shot back. And you're a delusional old woman who's been filling her head with romantic nonsense about a mother who never wanted her. That's when something inside Sophie seemed to snap. She stood up from her window seat, still clutching Elena's photograph. And for the first time since I'd known her, she spoke at full volume. You're lying. The words rang through the room like a bell, clear and strong and absolutely certain. Victoria actually took a step backward, shocked by the force of Sophie's voice. You're lying about my mama. Sophie continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. And you're lying about Mrs. Pauline being bad for me. She's the only person in this house who treats me like I matter. Sophie, you need to calm down, Victoria said. But for the first time, she sounded uncertain. I won't calm down, Sophie said. And I heard echoes of Elena in her voice, the strength of a woman who had fought for what she loved. I remember my mama. I remember her reading to me and singing to me and telling me she loved me more than all the stars in the sky. She didn't leave me. She died trying to come home to me. Victoria's face had gone pale. This wasn't the broken, silent child she'd been controlling for 3 years. This was a little girl who had found her voice and was using it to fight back. And I know you want to send me away. Sophie continued, tears streaming down her face, but her voice never wavering. I heard you talking to the doctors about the school in Switzerland. You think I'm too much trouble, and you want me gone so you can have Daddy all to yourself. That's not, Victoria began. But Sophie wasn't finished. Mrs. Pauline is the only person who's nice to me. She listens to me and teaches me things and makes me feel like maybe I'm not broken. But you want to take her away from me too. Just like you took away all my mama's pictures and my grandmother Sarah's music box. And everything that made me remember. I used to be happy. The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a fire, impossible to ignore or explain away. Victoria looked between Sophie and me, and I could see her calculating, trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her management. Sophie, she said, her voice taking on a soothing tone that felt completely artificial. You're upset and confused. Mrs. Pauline has been telling you stories that aren't true, filling your head with... She told me the truth, Sophie shouted. She showed me the newspaper articles about Mama's accident and grandmother Sarah's letters. I know what really happened, and I know you've been lying to me about everything. Victoria's face went white. The careful narrative she'd constructed, the version of events where Elena was the villain and she was the savior, had been completely dismantled by a 7-year-old child armed with facts. Where did you get newspaper articles? Victoria asked, her voice dangerously quiet. From the attic, Sophie said proudly. From Grandmother Sarah's trunk that you told me was just old junk. But it's not junk. It's my family's real story. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made us all freeze. Richard appeared in the doorway, still in his pajamas and robe, his hair disheveled from sleep. He looked around the room, at Victoria's pale, furious face, at my defiant stance, at Sophie, clutching the photograph, and his expression showed complete bewilderment. What's going on? He asked. I heard shouting. Victoria immediately moved toward him, her demeanor shifting into the role of concerned stepmother. Richard, darling, I'm so sorry we woke you. I found Mrs. Pauline in Sophie's room showing her inappropriate materials and upsetting her with stories about Daddy. Sophie interrupted, her voice carrying across the room with startling clarity. Daddy, look. She held up the photograph of Elena, and Richard's face went through a series of emotions. Surprise, pain, longing, and something that might have been guilt. Sophie, he said softly. Where did you get that? From Mama's trunk in the attic, Sophie said, walking toward him with more confidence than I'd ever seen her display. Mrs. Pauline helped me understand that Mama didn't leave me. She died in a car accident, didn't she, Daddy? She died trying to come home to me. Richard's composure cracked completely. I watched as this powerful man, this CEO who commanded boardrooms and controlled millions of dollars, was undone by his 7-year-old daughter speaking her mother's name with love instead of resentment. Yes, he whispered, his voice breaking. Yes, sweetheart. She died trying to come home to you. She was buying you a birthday present when it happened. I knew it. Sophie said, her voice filled with triumph and pain in equal measure. I knew Mrs. Victoria was lying when she said, Mama got tired of me. Richard's eyes went to Victoria, and for the first time, I saw him really look at his wife, not as the solution to his parenting problems, not as the woman who had rescued him from single fatherhood, but as the person who had systematically erased his first wife's memory and convinced his daughter that she'd been abandoned. Victoria, he said, his voice carefully controlled. We need to talk. But Victoria wasn't ready to surrender. She'd spent 3 years building this version of reality, and she wasn't going to let it crumble without a fight. Richard, you have to understand, she said, moving closer to him. I was trying to help Sophie move on. The therapists all said it would be easier for her to process if she understood that Elena had made a choice to leave rather than being a victim of random tragedy. It gives her some sense of control. No therapist would recommend lying to a child about her mother's death, Richard said, his voice growing cold. And Mrs. Victoria wants to send me away, Sophie added, as if she sensed this might be her only chance to be heard. To a school in Switzerland, where I'll have to live with strangers who don't know anything about Mama or Grandmother Sarah or our garden. Richard turned to stare at Victoria. What is she talking about, the Meadowbrook Institute? Victoria said quickly. We discussed this, Richard. Dr. Martinez recommended residential treatment for Sophie's attachment issues, and I never agreed to send Sophie to Switzerland. Richard said, his voice rising. I agreed to consider additional therapy options, not to ship my daughter off to another continent. You signed the preliminary papers, Victoria protested. Just last week I signed papers for a local consultation with a family therapist, Richard said. And now I could see real anger building in his expression. Not enrollment forms for a residential facility. The implications hung heavy in the air. Victoria had been forging documents, manipulating situations, orchestrating Sophie's removal from the house through deception and lies. The perfect stepmother facade had finally cracked completely, revealing the calculating woman underneath. Sophie, still holding her mother's photograph, looked up at her father with hope shining in her dark eyes. Daddy, can Mrs. Pauline stay? She's teaching me about gardens, and she listens to me, and she helped me remember that I used to be happy. Richard looked at me then, really seeing me for the first time since I'd arrived at his house. Is it true what Sophie's saying about the trunk in the attic? Yes, I said simply. Elelina's mother saved everything: photographs, medical records, newspaper clippings, letters. Sophie deserved to know the truth about her family, and Victoria told her that Elena had abandoned her. Among other things, I said, glancing at Victoria's increasingly desperate face. Richard was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what had been done to his daughter in the name of her own good. When he spoke again, his voice was deadly calm. Victoria, I think you should pack your things. 6 months later, I stood in what had once been Victoria's morning room, now transformed into a bright, comfortable space where Sophie did her homework and I planned the seasonal garden rotations. The pale yellow silk had been replaced with warm earth tone tones, and the delicate antiques had given way to sturdy furniture that could withstand the presence of a child who was finally allowed to be herself. Sophie sat at the large oak table we'd chosen together, carefully sketching plans for the memorial garden we were creating in Elena's honor. At 8 years old now, she had grown 3 inches and gained 12 pounds. Her face filled out with the healthy roundness that comes when a child feels safe and loved. More importantly, she chattered almost constantly, making up for 3 years of enforced silence with questions, stories, observations, and the endless commentary that flows from a curious, engaged mind. Mrs. Pauline, she said, looking up from her drawing. Do you think Mama would like the fountain we're planning? I want to make sure the water sounds happy, not sad. I think your Mama would love anything that makes you happy, I replied, settling into the chair beside her to examine her sketch. She had inherited Elena's artistic eye. The garden design was both beautiful and practical, with winding paths that led to quiet sitting areas and flower beds arranged to provide color and fragrance throughout the seasons. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. After Richard had asked Victoria to leave a request that had turned into a legal battle that lasted 3 months, Sophie had gone through what her new therapist called delayed grief processing. Years of suppressed emotions had come pouring out in waves of anger, sadness, confusion, and fear. There had been nightmares, tantrums, and days when she could barely speak at all. But there had also been breakthroughs. The day she'd asked if she could call me Grandma Pauline instead of Mrs. Pauline. The afternoon when she'd found a music box in Elena's trunk and spent hours learning to wind it and dance to the tinkling melody. The evening when she'd crawled into my lap during a thunderstorm and whispered, I'm scared, but I'm not alone anymore. Richard, too, had undergone his own transformation. The busy, distant father had been replaced by a man determined to truly know his daughter, to understand the child Elena Nena had died trying to protect. He had rearranged his work schedule to be home for dinner every night, had learned to braid Sophie's hair the way Elena used to do, and had started reading her the same bedtime stories that were mentioned in Sarah's letters. How did this happen? He had asked me one evening about 2 months after Victoria's departure. We were sitting in his study, no longer the formal, intimidating space it had been, but a warm room where Sophie's artwork hung alongside his business awards. How did I let someone convince me that my own daughter was the problem? I had chosen my words carefully. Grief makes us vulnerable, I told him. And sometimes when we're drowning, we grab onto anyone who promises to keep us afloat, even if they're not actually trying to save us. He'd been quiet for a long time after that, staring at a photograph of Elena and infant Sophie that now sat prominently on his desk. She was so beautiful, he'd said finally. Elena, I mean, not just physically, but she had this light inside her, this joy in everything. After she died, I felt like that light had gone out forever. Victoria promised she could help me find it again, but really, she was just dimming everything else until the darkness felt normal. Now, watching Sophie hum to herself as she colored in her garden plans, I could see that the light Elena had possessed lived on in her daughter. It had just been buried for a while, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. "Daddy's home early," Sophie announced, hearing the sound of Richard's car in the driveway. She jumped up from her chair and ran to the window, waving enthusiastically as he parked near the main entrance. These days, Richard used the front door like a father coming home to his family, not the service entrance like an employer checking on his staff. The change in routine was small, but it symbolized something much larger. The recognition that this was Sophie's home, not just a place where she was housed and cared for. "How are my girls?" Richard asked as he entered the room, loosening his tie and ruffling Sophie's hair. The casual affection between them still amazed me. So different from the formal distance that had characterized their relationship when I first arrived. "We're planning the fountain for Mama's garden," Sophie announced, holding up her drawing. "And Grandma Pauline taught me how to deadhead the roses so they'll keep blooming all summer," Grandma Pauline, Richard said, smiling at me with genuine warmth. "Have I mentioned lately how grateful I am that you're part of our family? The word still sent a warm shock through my system every time one of them used it. I had come here as hired help, a desperate widow willing to take any work that provided shelter. Now I was something I'd never expected to be again. Essential to people who loved me, valued not just for what I could do, but for who I was. Actually, Richard continued settling into one of the comfortable chairs we'd added to the room. "I have some news that I hope you'll both find exciting." Sophie immediately climbed into his lap, a privilege she'd been denied during the Victoria years, but now claimed freely. "What kind of news?" "The kind of news that comes in official envelopes from lawyers," Richard said, pulling out a document from his briefcase. "Pauline, I've been working with my attorney to formalize your position here. You're no longer technically an employee." I felt my breath catch. "What do you mean?" I have established a trust that provides for your housing, health care, and a generous monthly allowance for the rest of your life," he said, his voice becoming more formal as he outlined the legal details. "In exchange, you've agreed to serve as Sophie's companion, tutor, and guardian with full legal authority to make decisions about her welfare if anything ever happens to me." The papers shook in my hands as I tried to process what he was telling me. Financial security, legal protection, a guarantee that Sophie and I couldn't be separated by future circumstances beyond our control. Why? I whispered, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering. Richard's expression grew serious. "Because Sophie almost lost everything that mattered to her when Victoria tried to erase Elena Nena's memory and ship her off to an institution. Because I almost lost my daughter by trusting someone who saw her as an obstacle rather than a treasure. Because you fought for her when I was too blind to see what was happening." He paused, his arms tightening around Sophie, as if he still couldn't quite believe she was safe and happy in his embrace. "And because Elena would have wanted this," he continued softly. She would have wanted Sophie to have a grandmother figure who cherishes her, who preserves her memories, who helps her grow into the amazing person she's meant to become. You've given Sophie back her voice, her confidence, her sense of belonging in the world. I can never repay that, but I can make sure you never have to worry about losing each other again. I wiped tears from my eyes, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. The devastating loss of Conrad, the financial ruin that had forced me to take a job I'd never imagined needing, the risk I'd taken in defying Victoria to protect a child who wasn't mine by blood, but had become mine by choice. There's something else, Richard said, his tone becoming lighter. Sophie has a request to make. Sophie wiggled in his lap, suddenly shy but determined. Grandma Pauline, she said, using the name that still made my heart skip. Would you help me plant Mama's roses in the memorial garden? I want to use the seeds from Conrad's memory. The ones you brought from your old house. Conrad's memory. The roses I developed with my husband, the ones I thought were lost forever when we lost our home. I'd brought a few precious seeds here, had planted one as an offering to a lonely child at a window, and now that child wanted to use them to honor her own lost parent. I think I said, my voice thick with emotion, that Conrad would be honored to have his roses growing in Elena's memory garden. And I think your mama would love knowing that something beautiful came from all of our losses. Sophie beamed and slid down from her father's lap to throw her arms around me. I love you, Grandma Pauline, she whispered against my shoulder. Thank you for helping me remember how to be happy. As I held this precious child who had saved me as much as I'd saved her, I thought about the mysterious ways life weaves together. Threads of loss and hope ending and beginning, family lost and family found. I'd come to the Blackwood estate as a broken woman with nothing left to lose. I was staying as a grandmother, a guardian, a cherished member of a family that had been shattered but was slowly healing itself back together. That evening, as the three of us worked together in our memorial garden, planting Conrad's memory roses in soil that would nurture Elena's legacy, I felt the presence of the people we'd lost and the promise of the life we were building together. Sophie chattered constantly as she worked her voice, a melody of questions and discoveries and plans for the future. Richard listened with the attention of a father who had learned never to take his daughter's words for granted. And I dug my hands into the rich earth, feeling the satisfaction of knowing that some wounds, given enough time and care and love, can become the foundation for something even more beautiful than what was lost. The roses would bloom next summer, hardy and fragrant and lasting, like the new family we'd created from the broken pieces of our old lives, like the love that had grown from the simple act of leaving a flower on a lonely child's windowsill, like the courage Sophie had found to speak her truth and claim her place in the world. As the sun set over the gardens, I now tended not as an employee, but as a family member. I finally understood that some gifts come disguised as losses. And some families are built not from blood, but from choice, determination, and the revolutionary act of seeing a child's worth even when others have decided she's expendable. Sophie would grow up knowing she was loved, knowing her mother's story, knowing that she had a grandmother who would fight for her future no matter what obstacles arose. And I would grow old knowing that my own losses had led me to this second chance at family. This opportunity to nurture and protect and guide a remarkable little girl into becoming the woman her mother had dreamed she could be. It was, I thought, as Sophie's laughter rang across the garden, the most beautiful ending I could have imagined. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. Until